Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome to another movie review. Now we're actually talking about a movie that I actually do like, and decided to review an animated movie that, I've always liked and always thought was underrated. And today's animated movie I'm reviewing is the 2005 movie Hoodwinked, directed by Corey Edwards, Tom Edwards, Tony Leach, starring Anne Hathaway, Glenn Close, Jim Belushi, and Patrick Woodborough, to name a few. And I've always liked this movie. Now, for those who don't know what this movie is, well, the plot of this movie is as follows. In a twist on a classic fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf, and Granny give clashing accounts as a detective investigates a stolen recipe. So that's basically the premise to this movie. It's a rather simple premise, and now this movie was done by the Weinsteins, which, screw them, screw Harvey Weinstein and all those people, but this was a movie done by them, and it's an animated movie for kids, and I've always liked this movie. I always thought that this was a good kids movie, and I thought that this was a nice little clever spin on the Little Red Riding Hood story. The movie starts off, and I know this movie got mixed reviews when it came out by critics, but I've always liked it, and they did a sequel to this movie, which I was didn't really care for I only saw the second movie once, and I did not really care for it, but I've always liked this first movie. But anyways, the movie starts off where we're introduced, where the guy, a police detective by the name of Flippers, who is a frog, basically narrates Little Red Riding Hood. Everybody knows the story, but there's a truth to it, and to get to that truth, you have to turn the pages. And when he's narrating this, basically a book opens up with 3D stick figures popping out of the pages, a forest with trees and stuff, and we're introduced to Little Red Riding Hood, who is voiced by Anne Hathaway in this movie, and I think Anne Hathaway does do a good job with the material she's given, and when she goes to her house, and when Little Red Riding Hood goes to her granny's house, we see very obviously that the wolf guy, that the wolf is basically dressed up as her grandma. He's like, "Hey, yup, come in here." And I got to admit, I thought that the fake disguise he was wearing was actually kind of funny. And then Little Red Riding Hood notices that something's off, and she's like, "What big teeth?" She was like, "What big hands you have, what big ears you have." And then there's the funny part where the wolf is like, are we just gonna sit here all day talking about how big I'm getting? She's like, "What bad breath you have." And then the wolf's like, "All right, that's it." And then he takes the mask off he takes the mask off his face, and then is about to attack Little Red Riding Hood, but we see Granny get out the closet about to fight. And then there's this wild part where Paul Bunyan, who is basically like an actor, we don't know that yet, but basically he appears as a lumberjack, but he jumps through the window with an axe, screaming like a maniac, freaking everyone out. And then the cops go there, and, throughout the course of the movie, the cops basically interview each of these suspects, which are, of course, Little Red Riding Hood, the Granny, Paul Bunyan, and, of course, the wolf and stuff like that. And I would say of the detective characters, my favorite of the police detectives was probably Flippers, the frog. I thought that he was a rather good character, and I also like Detective Grizzly, the grizzly bear. I thought he was pretty good, and one thing I like about this movie is how, before we get into the detective side of it, we see Little Red Riding Hood basically, trying to get to her grandma's house because her grandma actually cooks these recipes and stuff like that, and basically has a business for selling cookies and, muffins and, whatnot, essentially sweets and goodies, and she has a secret recipe to do it, of course, but Little Red Riding Hood finds out that someone is after it. And what I think is really clever about this movie is how at the beginning of the movie, the movie tricks us because at the beginning of the movie, we think that the wolf is the one after the recipe, but the movie pulls a complete 180 on us, and I will admit, it was a good twist, which I'm not going to say what it is yet, but yeah, the movie makes you think the wolf is, like, and I think this movie was set up rather well with its mystery. And, of course, we get to the scene where Flippers is interviewing Little Red Riding Hood, and Little Red Riding Hood says, she was on her way to the place and stuff like that, and she came across the wolf, and once she's done interviewing, basically, all the other characters, like Paul Bunyan and the wolf, basically have to give their stories and stuff like that, and, we basically learned that this Paul Bunyan guy, the lumberjack, is basically an actor and stuff like that, and he also has, this truck he drives, but it's like a truck where he sells food to people. Basically a concession type of truck a food truck basically. And I like the part when Paul Bunyan's, practicing for his advertisement and stuff like that. And then of course there's the whole scene where Paul Bunyan sings, "I bring many joy to all the kids," and the kids are all eating their food, having a good time. And then Paul Bunyan and all the kids, after they're done dancing and singing, come back to his truck and find out that all of his food was stolen and stuff like that. And then Paul Bunyan, because he has a phone in the car, gets a call by the director of the commercials, who is a gecko, basically says, "Hey, we're going to have you audition again tomorrow. You think you can do that?" He says, "Yes, I will be ready." And then, of course, there's the whole scene where Paul Bunyan, goes into the woods and stuff like that. And, like I said, basically goes into the woods, and he, starts swinging an axe into a tree. And then when he's given this backstory, of course, we all see flashbacks and, the story play out when the characters are telling it. But Paul Bunyan, once he's done cutting down the tree, he hears a scream from inside of the house. And, inside of the house that Little Red Riding Hood is trapped in with her granny, and of course, her granny and her trapped by the wolf. But, when Paul Bunyan's walking down the hill, he sees that the tree falls, so the tree is rolling, he's behind it, he jumps on top of the tree, and is, running backwards on it when the tree's rolling down the hill really fast, and there are these two trees that stop the other log from rolling into the house, and then that causes Paul Bunyan to fall off and basically go flying through the window with an axe, making it look like he jumped when he really didn't. And then the detective, Flippers, is like, "Oh, so you didn't jump through the house, so you were basically thrown into the house." And he was like, "Basically, yeah." And then, of course, we get to hear the wolf's story, and the wolf's story is that he said word was on the street that she had a recipe, and so the wolf basically explains how he basically dressed up as Little Red's grandma, of course, and we basically learned that the wolf was a reporter, a quote unquote reporter, but yeah, we can see that's not exactly up to date and stuff like that, but of course, because a while back, he tried to, basically, the wolf tried to, get to the bottom of a case at one point, so he was basically trying to get on Red's case. And another thing I do like about the movie is that there's a certain bunny character, which does play a factor into the movie, but early on in the movie, a Little Red Riding Hood is in a ski lift, and the bunny, is talking to Little Red, and then Little Red said, "I gotta, get to Granny's and stuff like that," and said that it was dangerous in the woods. And then not long after she says that, the doors open on a ski lift as if, by accident, and then she basically falls down and keeps hitting some trees, and then she lands on the ground, and then she comes across the wolf, and she was like, "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," and the wolf says, "You make a good point. What is that right there?" She said, "That's some goodies." And the wolf basically asked, "Where are you going with that?" And then she says, "My grandma's." And she was like, "What else is in there? I don't think I should tell you," and stuff like that. And then, of course, the wolf scares her, but it's not on purpose, because we basically learned when the wolf is telling the cops, we see a flashback because there's a little squirrel companion friend to his that basically has a camera, but the squirrel accidentally closes something on his tail, which makes him open his mouth, which and moving his arms, scaring Little Red Riding Hood, and she goes away and stuff like that. And then the final interview is, of course, one of the final interviews, of course, is Granny. And we basically learn a twist with the movie, that Granny is not a normal Granny like we all think she is, with her, playing bingo and, all the other stuff that most grandmas do. We find out that she basically likes to take risk and she basically likes to have fun, going skiing on a hill, doing extreme stunts that are very, very risking for her life. Like, here's the thing. Like, she does so many risky stuff. Like, there are many times where she could have died. But she could have died several times, but she didn't. And in a way, I do kind of appreciate that they had a grandma like that in the movie. I mean, yeah, it is a little far-fetched, but whatever. It's a movie. It's escapism from reality, so it doesn't bother me one bit. But basically, as we're putting the puzzle together, Little Red Riding Hood is completely shocked to find out that her grandma is basically a skier and stuff like that. And not just her, like everyone, the police officers and the people being interviewed, the suspects, they all go to her closet and they find out that she won medals from doing a whole bunch of medals. Like, she has an entire closet of medals of skiing competitions that she's won and stuff like that, going on very high hills where avalanches can happen, mind you. So that, I thought, was a rather nice twist to the movie. And there's this certain bad guy speaking to someone on the radio when Grandma falls off, and we think that, and the bad guy, one of the bad guys basically thinks that the grandma's gone, but she really isn't, and she's basically just out of sight, hanging on a branch with a rope attached to it with a metal hook. And so she's alive, and the guy says Granny's taken care of. So then Grandma decides to get back up when no one's looking, and the bad guys think the deed is done. And then the grandma basically throws 2 dynamite sticks on the ground, basically to make the hill explode so an avalanche can happen. And then that's the whole part where, remember how I said the wolf was telling his story? Well, there's a part earlier on in the movie where Little Red Riding Hood is basically inside a mining cart, riding it on like these train tracks, but part of it exploded, and so like the part that she's safe on, and keep in mind it's a big mountain part, like she goes really fast on this mine cart and basically goes to like a track that's part of it's gone, and then she just goes flying in the air like this and is screaming, and the wolf's like, did you hear that? Come on, we got to go to Granny's and stuff like that, kind of giving a little context and stuff like that. And also I thought that the little squirrel guy was funny. Like, I like the whole part when the wolf basically says, oh, what type of candle are those? And then the squirrel says, dinamite, it must be Italian, basically referring to dynamite. And the wolf's like, no, get that candle out of here. And then, like an idiot, the squirrel drops it, and then there's like, it lights up a whole bunch of them in there, and like they have to like throw the dynamite sticks out so they don't blow up, and while they're doing it, the dynamite sticks behind them explode, making the track go away, and then we see the whole scene where Little Red Riding Hood basically goes flying in the air. I thought that scene was actually rather funny. And then we get to a twist about close to an hour into the movie. We finally know who the Goody Bandit is. It is the rabbit who was a good friend to Little Red Riding Hood earlier on in the movie. And I gotta say, that was actually a rather good plot twist. I actually did not see that coming, because with the way the movie was set up at the beginning, with the way it was set up, it seemed like it was all the wolf. But then the movie pulls a complete 180 on us. I thought, okay, that was actually a rather clever twist and stuff like that. But yeah. And then, of course, there's the whole finale where Little Red Riding Hood, she has her mouth taped up and is basically inside of the the ski lift and stuff like that, and with Dynamite in there, and then of course Mr. Wolf and all the guys basically have to. Not only do they have to get the recipe book, but they have to stop the bad guy. And I like the scene when Little Red Riding Hood says, "And I'm leaving with that recipe book." And he was like, "Oh, really?" and stuff like that. And then, of course, there's the whole scene where Little Red Riding Hood is fighting Bunny, and both of them are experienced in karate. And the Bunny uses his ears to block some of her moves, which I actually thought was kind of funny. And then, so like I said, there's the whole epic finale where Little Red Riding Hood and Granny escape by using, Little Red Riding Hood basically uses her red hood as like an apron. Same with the grandma with something similar to it. And, they're able to escape, but the bunny gets, who's falling from the ski lift, basically falls inside of a police, basically one of those large police trucks that, you put prisoners in the back of to sit in, and then he lands in there, and then he goes away. So yeah, at the end of the day, I thought that this was a rather fun movie. Again, it's not perfect. It's not one of the greatest animated movies of all time, but I liked this movie for what it was, and like I said, this is kind of like I thought this was a clever spin on the Little Red Riding Hood story, and this is also a movie that's kind of meant to like poke fun at the genre in a way. And while I don't think this movie is like as good as like say Shrek 1 and 2, for example, I do think it is much better than the third Shrek movie. So yeah, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Hoodwinked from 2005 an 8 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review, and yeah, we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.